Morning. We are in Daf Lamed Hey Amud Beis, right at the bottom. The Mishnah brought a machlokes. If there's a suffix, if there's a doubt of whether or not the Eruv was still valid at the onset of Shabbos, which is when the Eruv defines the space of the person. So at the moment the Shabbos begins, and we'll see in the Gemara that it's at sunset, at the beginning of Bein Hashmashos, at the beginning of twilight. That's when it defines the space for a person for Shabbos. And if at that moment the Eruv was invalid, such as it became tamei, it had burnt up, etc., then it would be there would be no Eruv. And in the Mishnah we have a machlokes between Rabbi Meir, who says that if there's a suffix with an Eruv, so we say that he loses out on both ends. And where Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Shimon say that anytime there's a suffix Eruv, you can be lenient. So if you have a suffix Eruv, you can be lenient according to Rabbi Yossi, and Rabbi Meir says that you cannot. And yet in regards to a mikvah, we saw that it was the other way around. That if there was a doubt whether or not when somebody was tamei d'Rabbanan, it was a doubt whether or not he went into the mikvah was maybe puzzle, or he doesn't know which mikvah he went into. So there, Rabbi Meir or the Stamish says you can be lenient. Rabbi Yossi says you cannot. So the Gemara says that the case that's going on over here is by the Eruv. What we have two witnesses that see the Eruv tamei at the onset of Shabbos, and they come in and testify, say at the onset of Shabbos we saw the Eruv tamei, or or burnt up, etc. And another two witnesses come in and say no, that happened after the onset of Shabbos. But at the onset of Shabbos, at the beginning of Shabbos, it actually was still valid.
On all these scenarios, when did the person who established the Eruv, when did he learn that the Eruv was either valid or invalid? In other words, a person could go out there on Shabbos afternoon, planning to have Shalosh Shudas and his makom, that he was going to, and he gets out and he finds out, oh, there's no Eruv here. So is that what we're talking about? I mean, the nafkamina would be whether he has to bring a chatas. What are the nafkaminas here?
The scenario is people walk into town and tell him that we saw your Eruv and it was burnt up. We saw your Eruv and it had become tamei before Shabbos started. And another set of witnesses come into him and say, actually, that's not the case. We saw it happen, but it happened after the onset of Shabbos. And so now he has testimony that says that the Eruv did not work because at the onset of Shabbos it was no longer valid. And he has another set of witnesses that come and say at the onset of Shabbos, it is good. And so he does have the Eruv, and now he has to decide, can he travel the 4,000 Amma to the next town where he needs to go? So what we had over here was a discussion of chazaka. In the case, we questioned the halacha of Rabbi Meir, and from chazaka, where Rabbi Meir says that if somebody went to sleep, two people went to sleep at night, and only one wakes up, and they know that during the night they touched the other person, and now in the morning they say, wait, if this person is deceased now, and I touched him in the middle of the night, perhaps I'm tamei. And Rabbi Meir says, no, they're not, because they had a chazaka that they were alive. The person was alive at the beginning of the night. So until you find that they are dead, the status quo is that they are alive. And so this person is not going to transmit tumah, and they remain tar. So why over here, in regards to the Eruv, which was kosher, tahor, up until that time, do you not say that there's chazaka in a case of doubt? To which the Gemara says there's actually two sets of witnesses. One set of witnesses says the Eruv was good at the onset of Shabbos, but the other set of witnesses says that it was not good anymore at the onset of Shabbos. So you can no longer have a chazaka and a status quo once witnesses come in and testify. And this is going to be the basis of this machlokas, and it's a very deep idea. What's the concept of chazaka? Chazaka tells me I have a status quo. I have an established norm that we know beforehand, and now you want to change that. So only at the moment that it changed, or the moment we know it changed, is when it changed, and we don't have a right to change it anytime beforehand. Actually, you have a pair of witnesses that say that they saw it change beforehand, and that diminishes or destroys the previous chazaka. That's what Rabbi Meir is going to say here. That you cannot rely on a chazaka that has witnesses testifying against it. Rabbi Yossi says, no, you can rely on the witnesses, but you also have a chazaka. That's a separate piece of information. The established norm, the status quo, and then you have a contradiction between the two sets of witnesses, and so we're going to go with the chazaka. But Rabbi Meir says, no, you cannot, because since the chazaka has been destroyed by a set of witnesses that say that the chazaka is incorrect, so you can no longer rely on it. So all you're left with is a trey, two sets of witnesses. One set says A, the other set says B. That creates an equal suffix, and therefore you don't have a chazaka to rely on. Rava Amar, however, Rava says that even in the case of Rabbi Meir, it could be that this trey, that there are two witnesses. One says that he was deceased in the middle of the night, and therefore the touching would have been tamei, and the other says no, he was not tamei, not deceased. Even if there were witnesses and the chazaka is gone, but over here there's a double chazaka in regards to the tuma, and therefore there's no comparison from the tuma at all. Rava Mahasab Trey Chazaki Lekula. There you have two chazakas. What are the two chazakas? The person was as a chazaka that deceased had a chazaka being alive until the moment that we know that they died, and the person that touched them had a chazaka that they were tor. The established status quo is that he was tor. He didn't come into contact to a deceased. So even if you have witnesses that the person was dead, but two witnesses either way, but you still have a chazaka of the person who was who touched this person, that they were tahor up until this point. So that a double chazaka like that should have the strength in such a case. But over here we only have one chazaka, the chazaka that it was a good kosher eruv at some point when they put it down, but and therefore it would have been good in regards for Shabbos. But since we have two sets of witnesses and one of them says that the eruv is not valid, so that remains not valid.
Is this not a sveka?
How so?
Well, you have a doubt whether he touched him, and you have a doubt whether he was dead.
No, we know he touched him. There's no doubt whether he touched him. We know he touched him. It's just a question if he was deceased at the time he touched him.
Okay, so you have two doubts anyway. You have two svekas. One suffix was whether you touched him, before or after he was dead, and one suffix whether he was dead or not.
Well, that's the same.
One suffix.
Did he touch? Right, that's all the same. Touched him whether or not he touched him, and the question is, was he deceased? There's just two chazakas there. It's one question. When A touched B, was B already dead? Right. That's the only question. We know A touched B. We know B was alive and at the beginning of the night and was dead in the morning. The question is, did A touch B when B was already deceased? Got it. But there's two chazakas. Chazaka is that A was alive and therefore assumed to be alive until such time we know they're not, and B was alive and so they're assumed alive until we know that they're not, and A was tahor. So we have an assumption to say that they're tahor until we know for sure that that's changed, and that we don't know. That there's no witnesses of for sure that they changed, even though could be one set of witnesses says that, look, you touched him when he was already deceased. But that's a double chazaka, and therefore it's going to be strong enough, Rava says. So kasher to Rabbi Yossi, but so that explains Rabbi Meir. Why Rabbi Meir is strict in regards to Eruv and lenient in regards to the deceased or the mikvah. We'll see more about the mikvah. But the question is, what about Rabbi Yossi? Rabbi Yossi in our Mishnah is lenient in regards to an Eruv and says that any suffix Eruv are going to be lenient. And Rabbi Yossi in regards to the deceased person says, in regards to the mikvah, says that you are strict. Amar Avuna Rachinana Shani Tuma Ha'il V'Yesha Le'Ikam. So Rabbi Yossi says there's a distinction. Tuma, even though that it's rabbinic tuma that he's strict about, but it is based upon tuma concepts in the Torah. So Gemara says Shabbos nami daraisa. Well, Shabbos is also daraisa. Because Rabbi Yossi Techumin Rabban. Rabbi Yossi says Techumin, the concept of not traveling outside of your city, 2,000 amma, is the Rabbanan. What level of this is the Rabbanan versus what level is the Oraisa? So the seeming meaning of our Gemara, which says that Tuma has a basis in the Torah and Techumin does not, it would seem to say that there is no concept of Techumin at all in the Torah. However, there are opinions that say, based on the opinions later and in the Yerushalmi, that there is a 12,000 amma outside of the city, the Oraisa level of Techumin. The maximum you could travel is 12,000. And what's rabbinic is to move it down 10,000 amma less to only travel 2,000 amma. A distinction of 3,000 feet versus like 18,000 feet. Either way, the statement is Rabbi Yossi says that this is the Rabbanan without a basis in the Torah, and therefore he's lenient in regards to Eruv, because it's a rabbinic matter, whereas Tuma, even though it's a rabbinic matter, but it's based in a Torah matter, and therefore he's strict. Or perhaps, he himself holds that you have to be strict even for Eruv, just as in mikvah. What he was quoting in regards to Eruv, that you can be lenient anytime there's a doubt whether or not the Eruv took effect, whether it was there, still existing or not. Rabbi, that's the teaching of his teacher. Dekanami, and in fact, it seems that way in our Mishnah. Diktani, for it says, Amar Rabbi Yossi says, Avtulmus Hayid. Avtulmus is the one who testified in Mishum Chamisha Zakenim in the name of the 5 elders, Shesafik Erev Kasher, that a Safik Erev is Kasher. Now, if Rabbi Yossi already said this, why did they have to quote Avtulmus? Because that was Avtulmus's base. Rabbi Yossi was quoting Avtulmus, his teacher, but it was not actually his own opinion. Shemamina. So indeed, we see that Rabbi Yossi himself may not hold that. He was just quoting in our Mishnah. He was quoting his teacher Avtulmus. Rava says, the reason by a mikvah he's strict is because it's particular to mikvah. Because the person that entered the mikvah had an established norm, a chazaka, of being tameh. You want to remove that tumah from him, even if it's a rabbinic tumah, but you want to remove it and change it when you don't even know whether he went to the mikvah or not, whether the mikvah was valid or not. So that's the reason. The reason is, and how it's distinct from over here, the Eruv over here was a valid Eruv to start with. Everybody agrees with that. When it was put down, it was valid. It just either got burnt up or got covered or got tameh, whatever it was. But it became invalid later. So it started off with a chazaka, with an established norm of being okay. The mikvah is the other way around. The person that went into the mikvah started off with a tumah. Yes, it's true, it was a rabbinic tumah, and so you can be lenient in some ways. But there's a chazaka that says he was tameh. So ve'ema lo tamal. So we have to say that he never that if you have a doubt whether the mikvah was valid, so perhaps he never went to the mikvah, and therefore he remains tameh. So Gemara says, Adrabah, hamid mikvah chaskasa ve'ema lechaser. Well, the mikvah was at once a kosher mikvah. Now you find that it's doesn't have the requisite 40 saw. Well, maybe we should say the established norm was that it was a valid mikvah, and until such time that you know that it became invalid, which is after he went into the mikvah, you should assume that it was a good mikveh. And say at the time that he went to the mikveh that it was not missing from the 40 sa. So the Gemara says, it's a mikveh that actually does not have an established norm. And then later we find that it was actually less, and we don't know if at the time it was valid or not. What's the case of Rabbi Yossi that says that a Eruv is going to be kosher if it was a suffix? Eruv teruma. He put teruma down there. Either he's a kohen, according to one opinion, or the other opinion that says that even a non-kohen can use teruma since it is edible to the kohen. But when it becomes tameh, if the teruma becomes tameh, it's not edible even to the kohen. But now we have a doubt of whether it became tameh after Shabbos set in, and so therefore at the onset of Shabbos it was still a valid eruv, or prior to Shabbos, when it was still day, meaning before Shabbos, and therefore it would be invalid because the eruv would be invalid because at the time of the onset of Shabbos it was not a valid eruv. Similarly, the peiros, produce, and he put down produce as his eruv. And there's a question of whether or not it was tithed after or before it was a valid eruv, the onset of Shabbos. So he put down produce that had not been tithed, and now it's a question of whether or not, and since he can't eat it because it's untithed, it's not going to be a valid eruv. But he went back home and took some produce to untithe, to tithe the produce that's out there. And the question is of whether that happened before or after the onset of Shabbos. Suffix eruv kosher. So this is when we say that there is a suffix, a doubt whether the eruv is valid or not, and kosher is going to be kosher. But if from the onset he put down teruma that was not known to be tahor, it's a doubt whether or not it's tahor. So it was never a valid eruv on account of that. We never knew whether it's good or not. Or he put down produce and we don't know whether it was tithed or not from the onset. Ain't a suffix eruv kosher. There we're not going to say it's a suffix of a kosher eruv because we never knew from the start. We never knew whether it was valid. In the previous cases, it was valid when he put the eruv down, and it's a question of whether or not it became invalid. Now that's true for the first case, but it's not true for the case of when he tithed it, because it was for sure not valid, and it's a question whether he made it valid. So so what are you going to say? Teruma, it was valid, and we're going to say keep it at its status quo, and the chazaka is that at the onset, when I put it down, it was a valid piece of teruma, and so I'm going to say at the onset of Shabbos, it was still valid, because I don't know it became invalid. Well, that's not true in regards to the produce that was untithed, because it was invalid when I put it down, and keep it at that status until I know for sure that I had made it valid. And over here, I don't know whether I made it valid or not. So how are you comparing the two? So with the produce as well, you put down produce that are inedible because they have not been tithed. And now you went back home and you tithed in. It's a question whether you got it in before the onset of Shabbos or not. So there, it was the complete opposite of the teruma. The teruma were valid to start with, and that's the chazaka, and it's a question when it became invalid. These produce were invalid to start with, and it's a question if I made it valid soon enough that it was valid prior to Shabbos. So how are you comparing the two? So in fact, keep the chazaka of it being invalid, untithed produce, and it should be and say that you didn't properly correct it. You didn't fix it and take the tithes prior to Shabbos.
Is there a general chazaka by parents that they're tevel?
Well, they always start off as tevel, right?
They do start off as tevel. So if you just find a pile of fruit there, you assume it's tevel. Is that right?
No. That's not necessarily the case, because we also have an assumption that people would not allow produce out of their possession untithed. right?
That's
A person's not going to allow, somebody who cares about halacha is not going to allow something invalid or inedible or prohibited out of their possession without fixing it. So when I just find produce, there's no chazaka that it is invalid. But here he knows he brought produce that was tevel. That's the case. He brought produce that's tevel, put it down there, and then he's going to go home and tithe it. So don't say that there's a question if he got it in to fix it prior to the date. Rather, the question is this: that these produce were for sure valid, and they had already been tithed, but untithed produce got mixed into it. And the question is, at what point they got mixed in? That's the question. Not nitkanu, that they got fixed, but nidma'u, they got mixed up. Or they got mixed up with untithed produce after Shabbos had already come in, and that's the question. And so there, it's the same. It is symmetrical with teruma. They're both talking about that you had valid produce prior to Shabbos, and when you put it down, and at some point it either became tameh in the case of teruma, or became mixed up with untithed produce in the case of the tevel, the produce. And so the question is, at what point it became invalid? So there you have a chazaka that it started off valid, so we're going to retain that. And that's going to be a suffix, eruv, which you're going to be lenient on. Where do we say that you can't be lenient? Where you never had an established order that was okay. From the moment you put down the eruv, there was already a doubt of whether it was kosher or not, whether it was valid or not. Rav Shmuel Bar Yitzchak Rav Huna. Rav Shmuel Bar Yitzchak asked Rav Huna a question: how to look at chazaka in a manner where I actually know for sure there's something valid there. I just don't know which one it is. He has 2 loaves of bread in front of him. I know for sure one of them became tameh, but I don't know which one it is. In other words, I saw a tummy person touch one, or I saw a sheretz run over one of them. Whatever it is, whichever tuma came to this, but it's only one, and I don't know which is which. So from a practical perspective, I have no access over here to food, because I can't eat either of them, because one of them is invalid. One of them is truma tameo, which is prohibited. So I can't eat either bread. However, klape shmaya galia, up in heaven they know, or the CC the video cameras can show, the replay can show which one it is. I simply don't know which one it is. But the truth of the matter is, one of them is kosher, one of them is edible. I just don't know which it is. So practically, I can't eat it. But there is a kosher loaf of bread there. So can I say I have an eruv? Because after all, there is a kosher loaf of bread there. Or can I say I don't have an eruv? Or do I say I don't have an eruv because even though there's a kosher loaf of bread, none of them are actually kosher because I can't eat either. I can't eat it out of doubt, but I can't eat it. So neither of them are actually edible. So the Gemara says, Tabayla Rabbi Meir, Tabayla Rabbi Yossi can ask the question according to Rabbi Meir or to Rabbi Yossi. Tabayla Rabbi Meir can be a question according to Rabbi Meir, even though he's strict over there. At Kalakam Meir Hasam the Lekatar. He's only strict because this one is for sure tummy, and I don't know when it became tummy, so you have to be strict because it's for sure tummy, and there's nothing valid to be eaten. But over here, this is for sure a valid bread to eat. So I have a good eruv. Or I could say even if Rabbi Yossi, it's no good. Look, why? Because Rabbi Yossi only said it over there. The im isa the hitara yadala. Because I know that this was tar at the time I put it down, and as long as it was tar, it was tar. So I know which one it is. But over here, either way, I don't know which one it is. So at the onset, when I put it down already, I cannot eat either of them. Says you're right. According to everybody, it's not going to be a valid eruv because I need to be able to have a meal. It needs to be a bread that's edible. And according to everybody, according to Rameya and Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yossi, they are not valid. Both of them are not valid to be eaten. Rava asked Rav Nachman, what about this? Kika zu ayom chol ulamacha kodesh. If he says, look, this bread right now is not kodesh. It's not holy. It's a regular piece of bread. However, I dedicate it to the Beis Hamikdash. I dedicate it to kodesh at tomorrow. When Shabbos comes, this becomes kodesh. So he says, "V'amar irvu li bazeh," and he says, now use this bread as my eruv. So at the onset of Shabbos, it becomes kodesh and inedible to me. At the onset of Shabbos is when I need it to be my meal to designate my space. Amalei eruv ve'eruv. He says for that the eruv is going to work, and essentially, as we're going to see, the moment of kodesh, when I dedicate this item to Beis Hamikdash and make it holy, it happens at the end of Bein HaShmoshes, at the end of twilight, when Shabbos is, when it's for sure the end of Friday and properly Shabbos. Whereas my definition of my place for Shabbos is at the time that I can no longer do malacha, which is at the onset of Bein HaShmoshes, at the onset of twilight, at the moment sun sets and I cannot do any malacha anymore. That defines my space for Shabbos. And so the Eruv happens earlier than my dedication to the Beis Hamikdash, and therefore at the onset of the Eruv aspect of Shabbos, it's still edible. It only becomes sanctified and inedible at the end of Bein HaShmoshes. And so therefore the reverse is also going to be true. If this is Kodesh, and I say I'm going to redeem this onto my coins, I'm redeeming it out of Hektish. However, I don't want it to take effect now. I want it to take effect on Shabbos. So tomorrow is when this becomes a non-Kodesh. He says, now use this for me as my Eruv. It's not going to be an Eruv again because this is the transfer out of Hektish is going to happen only at the end of twilight. Maishna. So he asked, what's the difference? He said to him, go measure out a cup of salt for me, and I'd be willing to tell you. In other words, you have to do something to learn something like this. Either try and figure it out. There's different versions as to what this phrase is. It shows up multiple times. It's a phrase, okay, I'll tell you, but you have to do some work for it. Hayom chol olamacha kodesh. If he says today, it's still plain, and tomorrow it'll be sanctified. Misveka lenachtaloi. At the doubt time, in other words, at Bein HaShmoshes, it did not yet become sanctified. Kedusha, it only happens at the end of the onset of twilight, at the complete onset of Shabbos. However, the reverse, when I say today it's holy, and tomorrow it'll be redeemed, it's only going to become redeemed at the end. It's not going to leave Kedusha until at the end of twilight. So we learned. If we have somebody who's a Tvul Yom, that means he himself is went to the mikveh and he can make something tummy. And he filled a barrel full of tevel, of untithed produce, but actually it's maaser, it's tithed produce that goes to the Levi. Remember, we talked about that the Levi has to take of the 10% of the produce that he gets, he has to take 10% and give it to the Kohen. Until he does so, it's maaser tevel. It is tithe, which is tevel, which is untithed, because it's his tithe, but it's still untithed. He can't eat it because there's a 10% that he has to take off. And if he eats it while it's still tevel, meaning before he takes that 10% off, which is teruma, it is a prohibition. It's actually severe prohibition. It's going to be b'misa. It has a death penalty from Shamayim, not in court, but from Shamayim. and therefore it's not going to be a valid eruv. This produce that is the tithe that goes to the Levi that has not been tithed to the Kohen, 10% of that to the Kohen is invalid for an eruv, because it's not edible. However, Tavul Yom, somebody who went to the mikveh that day and cannot eat kodesh until the evening, but he himself is tamei. It's Tavul Yom. It's this in between state of tamei. Mutar b'negia. So he's going to be allowed to touch this bread. Yeah. Even though this produce, even though it has some 10% that's going to become truma later, he's allowed to touch this. Now, he takes some of this produce that's in this barrel that he put in, and he says this should be the teruma for the rest of this. And when will it be teruma? In the evening. And he says this measure that I'm taking out of this produce. So again, he has 10% that the Levi got from the entire produce. And of that 10% he has to give to the Kohen. And he does, and he says that I'm giving it to the Kohen, but it should only take effect in the evening when the sun sets. Dvar of Kayamim. That works as setting the teruma in the evening. And therefore, if he said, I want to use this mixture as my eruv, it's not going to be valid, because again, the onset of the teruma, the dedication happens after twilight, at the end of Bein Hashmashos, and the definition of your eruv, of where your Shabbos space is defined at the beginning of twilight, at sunset, when the beginning of Shabbos begins. Amar Rav, that tells us at the end of Fridays when the eruv becomes a valid eruv. It's not yet Shabbos. And we turn to Lamed Vav at base 36b. The Isak Adat Tchilas Hayom Kona eruv, because if you're going to tell me just like the dedication of Teruma and the dedication of the Kodesh, which happens at the end of twilight when it's for sure Shabbos, if that's when the eruv is set, so then why, when he says I use this produce for the eruv, it's no good? It should be good because at the same time that it becomes an eruv, meaning at the end of twilight when it becomes Shabbos, that's the moment that it also becomes a valid teruma, a valid separated produce. It must be that we see that these, as we explained before, the onset of Shabbos, which is the end of twilight, when it's for sure Shabbos, it's no longer in transition between Friday and Shabbos. That's when all the transactions that he says, I want this to become sanctified on Shabbos, I want this to become teruma on Shabbos, whatever he's making in making this produce proper, that happens at the end of Shabbos, at the end of twilight, at the onset of Shabbos. Whereas the eruv happens at the end of Friday, when he can no longer do malacha, even though it's out of this in twilight zone, but nevertheless, he's no longer, it's at the end of Friday, at the beginning of that twilight, that Shabbos begins in regards to eruv. Rav Papa says, well, it's true, but you don't need to prove it from here. You can't prove it from here, because actually it's possible that the eruv happens at the same time that at the onset of Shabbos, at the end of twilight. But nevertheless, it has to be that prior to then, it was an edible meal, and it wasn't edible until it was already Shabbos. So at the moment that the eruv has to happen, is when it becomes edible. But it has to be edible prior to that, and it's not. Okay, we're at the Mishnah of Lamed Vav Amid Beis, and this gets to the concept of Bereira. John, want to tell us what Bereira is? It's your favorite.
There ain't no such thing.
So Bereira is, John didn't have coffee yet, so he doesn't talk. Bereira is the concept of where I can retroactively define something beforehand. And we're going to see multiple cases in our Mishnah. The Mishnah talks about where I have information somebody's coming to a town near me, and I want to be able to go on Shabbos. Both of them are 4,000 amma away from me. So I need to put down an Eruv in between my town and where I want to go. I need to go. The problem is I don't know which side it is. Are they coming to the east? They're coming to the west. They're coming to the north. They're coming to the south. So what I do is I put an Eruv on either side, and I say, if they're in the town on the east, my Eruv on the east counts. If I'm I put down the Eruv on. If they are currently in the west, my Eruv is in the west. So there, it actually is a lesser degree of Berera. That means it actually is defined now. I'm defining by something that exists now. They are in the town in the east, or they are in the town in the west. I just don't know where they are right now. And so I'm putting an Eruv of both sides, but I only want the one that is currently defined. But I don't have the information to retroactively, when I find out, define the Eruv. That's one level of Berera. The second level of Berera is that they are not yet here. They're not yet in the east, or they're not yet in the west. They will come at some point to one of those towns. For instance, my teacher is coming. That's one of the cases in the Mishnah. My teacher is coming to teach. They are currently in the north, 2,000 amma away from two towns that are 4,000 amma away from me. Both towns are 4,000 amma away. One is northeast, one is northwest. And my teacher is coming and is currently in a town that is 2,000 amma away from that, in the center between them. So I don't know where they're going to end up going. Are they going to the northeast town or to the northwest town? So I have to put an Eruv down. They can travel the 2,000 amma to either. I don't know where they're going, so I'm going to put an Eruv between each one of the cities. And wherever they end up going later on Shabbos, will retroactively define my Eruv. Is that clear? Anybody want to volunteer and say yes? Otherwise,
Yes.
I'll repeat that.
The way
It's clear.
but
I'm going to do it again. I'm in.
a Tanai, and I wasn't aware that a Tanai is necessarily Brera. A Tanai is, if this is true, then that, and I'll do that. If that's true, then I'll do that. It just gives you an option to do one of two things. But
No, and Tanai is I'm doing it now. I'm conditioning something now on something else, but I'm doing it now on the condition of something else. This is not a condition. I'm actually doing two things, and I want either one of them to take effect, and it'll be defined later. So I'm putting down a meal and saying, I'm defining my Shabbos space. I'm defining my Shabbos space on the east, or maybe on the west. I'm defining my Shabbos space. I'm either on the east or on the west, and I'm putting a meal on both sides. That's a condition. I'm conditioning on wherever my teacher is, but I'm actually doing an action on both sides, and one of them, and later I'll find out which one of them was valid and which was not valid. That's a form of Brera.
wait, there's a fundamental thing here, because I would think that you could, if I wanted to, I could have 10 Eruvs. My food, I'll put them where I want, and whichever I want to use on Shabbos, that's the one I'm going to use.
That's Brera. That's a later I'm defining my previous act.
You could
I
only
put
have
down a
one-
meal on the west,
No,
and I'm later going to invalidate it by choosing to go to the east.
Yeah, so you're saying you could actually only have one Eruv, and you're finding out which one it is retroactively.
Right. If you conditioning would be this, I put down an Eruv on the east, but only on the condition that my teacher is actually in the town 4,000 am away in the east. So I say, I put down this Eruv, but I don't want it to work unless my teacher is actually there. If he's not there, I want to be at home for Shabbos, and therefore I can take a walk east, west, south, or north. That would be a condition. That's not Brera. I'm making one Eruv with the condition that my teacher is there. Brera is I put an Eruv in two places, and I'm going to retroactively choose one of them.
No, but
by an existent.
I'm off that. I'm on a different thing. I'm saying I might think, okay, what's the big deal? You know what? I put my Eruv in the north, and at the end, you know what? Didn't feel good that day. I just didn't go out there. So nothing happened. I just didn't use the Eruv. I had an Eruv, didn't use it. But you're saying, so actually, if you had two Eruvs established, and you only used one of them, the other one is not your Eruv. You're saying you can't have two and just not use it.
Well, they're contradictory. If you remember, when I define my space, 2,000 amma outside my city on the east, I'm not allowed to exit the city at the west at all. So the Eruv 2,000 amma on the west is actually a contradiction, indirect contradiction to my Eruv on the east. And therefore, only one of them can be valid. And I'm later going to define which one it is. So in this simple case, it is already defined. I simply don't have the information. Meaning my teacher is already either on the east or on the west. And I'm going to later find out which one is defined. The case, the next case that we spoke about is, again, I'll give this scenario. I'm in city A, and directly northeast and directly northwest are two towns, 4,000 amma away. So in order to travel to either one, to B and C, I need to put an Eruv in between either one. My teacher is currently at the onset of Shabbos in town D. Both of them are equidistant, less than 2,000 amma from B and C. So I know my teacher who on Shabbos plans on traveling to either B or C to teach are within reach for me. D is out of reach. But on Shabbos, they're going to go to one of the towns to teach. I just don't know which. And so I'm going to put an Eruv to both. And on Shabbos, when they define where they're going to go, I'm then going to define where my Eruv is. So as opposed to the first case, I already can define, if I had the information, where my Eruv is. I simply don't have the information because my teacher is either to the west or to the east. I just don't know where. So I'm putting an Eruv on both sides. But there's already information out there upon which my Eruv could be based now, before Shabbos. In the last case that we were talking about, actually, there's no information right now. On Shabbos is where the information is going to, the definition is going to come in order for me to retroactively, before Shabbos, define my Eruv. And the question is, do we say Breira even in such a case? So we have the Mishnah. Let's quickly go through it. And then we have 2 minutes, and then we have to go to Slichos. So Masna Adam al Eruva, a person can make a condition on his Eruv. And he says, if on Shabbos, the people that are chasing me are going to come from the east, say Eruv Lamarav. So the food on my west side are the Marav, because I have to run. Min Marav, they come from the west side, Eruv Lamizrach. So then I'm running to my Eruv is on the east side. In Bo Lakan, if they come from both places, well then Lamakam Sheretz Eilech, I can go wherever I want. I can choose then where they're going to come. And now, obviously, in this case, none of this is defined before Shabbos. This is defined on Shabbos when the tax collector, as the Gemara tells us, comes. And if they don't end up showing up on Shabbos, the tax collector never comes, well then my Eruv is null and void. Neither of the Eruvs work, and I'm like the people in my city. Same as if I say my teacher comes, and it comes from the east side. Eruv Lamizrach, so I'm going to go to the east. And the east side Eruv is valid. Min Amarav, Eruv Lamarav. He comes from the west. My west side Eruv is valid. Balakan, he comes. I have a teacher. One teacher goes to each one of these towns. So the Makar Sheretz Eilech, I could go to whichever one I want. Loilakam, my teacher didn't show up to either of the towns. Hareini Kabinei Iri, I'm just like my regular city dweller. Rabbi Yehuda Eimer, Echad Mehen Rabbi, it's a rabbi. If one of them is his main teacher, he's going to go to his teacher, and that's what's the definition. If they're both teachers, even if one is a greater or more defined teacher of his, he could go wherever he wants. So this is the Mishnah. Tomorrow we'll see what are we talking about, teacher versus tax collector, and then we'll see the concept of Breira in these Eruvs as we explained.